Our words upon which you may meditate or think this morning come from the Reverend Orloff Miller, who will be mentioned in my sermon. He was one of the active Unitarian Universalist ministers during the civil rights time in Selma. He said, "I've been asked many times what business white clergy had in Selma, Alabama. What right did we have telling folks how they should run their lives? We not only had a right, we had a responsibility to be there because some of our family, our black brothers and sisters, were not being treated fairly. And whenever people are not being given their fair shot at having a full and meaningful life, we have a responsibility to do what we can to help change that. And if it means we have to argue with our brothers and sisters about that, then we better get in there and argue about it and help them to see that there is another way of living as one human family. Yes, I think white people had a responsibility, and white ministers especially had a responsibility to be in Selma, Alabama." I invite you to join in with the choir for hymn number 124, "Be That Guide." So over the years, I've heard a number of our Unitarian Universalist ministers recount their personal stories about answering the call from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Selma following the horrendous violence that befell the peaceful protesters on what became known as Bloody Sunday. King, who, as we know, was committed to nonviolence, hoped that the march from Selma to Montgomery would open people's eyes and hearts to the injustice of voter discrimination. About 500 Unitarian Universalists, including around 200, 1/5 of our Unitarian Universalist ministers, plus lay people like Viola Liuzzo, who you may have heard her story, went to Selma and to Montgomery to participate in the civil rights campaign. There was only one Unitarian Universalist, the Reverend Richard D. Leonard, who joined the 300-person march all the way from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. Some, like my friend the Reverend Tom Owen Toll, who served First Unitarian Universalist San Diego, participated by helping set up the campsites. People had to go and prepare the place for the marchers to sleep every night. So there was a lot of different work going on to make that happen. It has seemed to me over the years that for everyone who participated, the event was life-changing, and for ministers it was formational to their ministry and their understanding of compassion and justice. One of those ministers is the Reverend Clark Olsen, who just died a couple of months ago in January. Clark was a gentle, soft-spoken, dear man that many of us really loved. and we admired him immensely. He had retired to Asheville, North Carolina, so occasionally we got to see him at our Southeastern Unitarian Universalist ministers gatherings that happen at The Mountain, our camp and conference center in North Carolina. In 2006, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association held a convocation in Birmingham, Alabama. And following that event, some of the people stayed over to make a trip to Selma, learn more about the events of the time, including what happened in Birmingham, what happened in Selma, and to walk together across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On that day, both Reverend Olsen and Orloff Miller, the person whose words I read earlier, were with us. They were the two people walking with James Reeb, Reverend James Reeb, when he was clubbed and killed in Selma. And we went to the cafe that is either in the same place or very close to where Walker's Cafe was. Walker's Cafe was where Jim and Clark and Orloff all went to eat after the march that day. And on their way out, they were attacked by 3 or 4 white men who knew they were in town for the march. Unfortunately, one of them would have been walking on the outside by the curb, happened to be James Reeb. And so when the man yielding the club came, Reeb caught that in the head, and he died a couple of days later. Reverend Olsen has commented many times on the story, but he told the Citizens' Time of Asheville in 2015, "Chances, happenstance. I'm alive, he's not." And I don't think that Clark was ever able to talk about that day or that story without being moved to tears. Some people are convinced that it took the death of a white minister to truly get the nation's attention. Because, earlier an African-American man had died and it didn't receive nearly the attention. A few months later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act banning racial discrimination within voting practices by federal, local, and state governments. And every year there's a reenactment of that march, and on the 50th anniversary, many of us attended a UUA Marching in the Arc of Justice conference honoring the 50th anniversary, which took place in Birmingham, as well as along the route of the march and in Selma, because, we took a bus ride there and relived some of that story. Both Orloff and Clark were there then, and also my friend Tom Owen Toll, who, with his co-minister wife, Carolyn. For a lot of people who came, it was the first time back in Selma in 50 years. So it was a very emotional time for a lot of people who gathered there. And it was a huge crowd, huge. This year was the 54th anniversary, and I understand that there were speeches from some of our 2020 hopefuls. Probably the most captivating story for me was told by the Reverend Larry McGinty, who was the minister at the Birmingham Unitarian. It was a Unitarian, so if I say Unitarian in this, it's not that I'm forgetting the Universalists. It's just that not all of the congregations had changed their name to Unitarian Universalist at that time. So Birmingham held on to Unitarian for a really long time. But they are now the Unitarian Universalist Church. But he tells it in a sermon that he wrote for his Indiana congregations several years later, and he called it 16 Days of Crisis for a Group of Insiders. Are you familiar with that story, some of you? Good. So I'll share a little of it with you. I would hate it if you said, "Oh yeah, we know that." So for the Birmingham Unitarian Church, this 16 days of crisis began with the ringing of the church telephone at about 10 o'clock that evening. The nominating committee was meeting to discuss the new officers for the 1965-66 year, and the caller told of the attack that I just told you about, and indicated that an ambulance carrying the injured clergyman was en route. One of the committee members was a physician who alerted the hospital and called for the most outstanding neurosurgeon, then rushed to the hospital himself. And then soon after that, another church member, who was Dr. Joseph Volker. Some of you may know that name. If you go to UAB, you'll see the Volker building. He was the person who kind of started the church in Birmingham. He was vice president in charge of health affairs of the University of Alabama, and he arrived and ordered every needed resource of the medical center to be readied to care for Reeb when he arrived. Reeb arrived around 11 o'clock, underwent emergency surgery, and as McGinty puts it, a vigil of anguished waiting began. Now, this story leaves out the anguish of getting Reeb to the hospital in Birmingham because no white ambulance companies would carry him. Finally, a black funeral home offered to provide an ambulance. And here is how Reverend Clark Olsen described that experience. He's saying that his Selma had been a mixture of anger, fear, sorrow, wonder, and pride. Anger about Jim Reeb's death, about those who attacked the three of us, and about the Alabama system of injustice, including an all-white male jury that found innocent the three men who had been charged with killing Jim. Selma was fear, he wrote, re-experienced fairly often in telling friends or family about the events of that terrible night in Selma. The men coming across the street, shouting angry words, carrying a club, waiting at the clinic while the doctor examined Jim, fearing Jim's death as he squeezed my hand more tightly as his head pain increased and before he sank into unconsciousness, fearing for all of us when our ambulance had a flat tire just after leaving Selma's city limits on the way to the hospital in Birmingham, and the ambulance radio telephone wouldn't work. Especially fearing when a car full of white men pulled up behind us on the country road, then followed us back to town while we drove on the rim of our flat tire, headed for a phone that would bring a replacement ambulance. Fear turned to terror when the car full of men parked next to our waiting ambulance and walked around the ambulance knocking on the windows. I thought they might have buried us in a watery ditch that night, the same kind of ditch where the bodies of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had recently been found in Mississippi, and fear that Jim would die before we arrived at the Birmingham hospital. Now, Reverend McGinty, who was at that time the minister in Birmingham, was in Tuscaloosa to participate in Religious Emphasis Week at the University of Alabama, when on Wednesday morning, March 10th, his wife called to tell him what had happened the night before. He left immediately for Birmingham, and 1 mile from the hospital, he collided with a big truck and ended up injured himself somewhat. The driver was fine, and McGinty ended up arriving at the hospital in Birmingham in an ambulance. And he had to be treated for some gashes on his face. So when he showed up at Reeb's room, people were confused and thought that he had been in Selma also. And he had to keep explaining, no, I was not in Selma. And then he learned that Reeb was unconscious and had little chance of survival. That afternoon at 3 o'clock, Mrs. Reeb arrived, accompanied by Duncan Howlett, a name you might be familiar with. He was minister of All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., and one of the people who's written a lot of things over the years for Unitarian Universalists to read. And that was where Reverend Reeb served, at that All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., with him. Other ministers, friends of Reeb, and representatives of various organizations, some of whom had been in Selma and some who just began to arrive at the hospital, were there. And one of those was Reverend Charles Blackburn, who was serving as the first minister of the Huntsville Church at that time. He was a friend and a former member of James Reeb's All Souls Church in D.C. So the hospital provided some special quarters for Mrs. Reeb, and the Birmingham Unitarians provided hospitality for everyone else who came to town. And that is when the real 16 days of crisis gets going, because over the next 16 days, the Birmingham church people housed and fed and provided transportation for hundreds of visitors of both races from all over the country who came to see Reverend Reeb when he was in the hospital or came to attend the memorial services. There were several because so many people were concerned. There were vigils and things around the city, but there were two services, big ones, one in Birmingham and one in Selma. And Martin Luther King Jr. came to Selma to deliver the eulogy. The board, and then people came to do the march, and especially on the last day. The board of directors of the Unitarian Universalist Association asked the Birmingham church, and they felt they couldn't say no, to act as a clearinghouse for the Unitarian Universalist participation in the last day of the march. The UUA board also adjourned its meeting and headed to Selma to participate. There were serious repercussions for our congregations who were visible or whose ministers were visible in this event. Numerous threats and fearful encounters. Now, I moved to Birmingham in 1968, so this was all history when I got there, and I didn't even hear people talk about it. But the parents of my friends were the adults that were involved. And because I was a member of that church as a teenager and then later as an adult, I stayed connected to those families. So when I was studying to be a minister at Meadville Lombard, I was able to get a lot of firsthand information and do interviews with people who had participated as part of my UU history project. One of the favorite stories from the Birmingham church is that the church secretary, Eve Gerard, who I knew, received a call from someone threatening to plant a bomb in the church, and she calmly told him, "You'll have to get in line. There are several ahead of you." At that time, I called Reverend McGinney and I asked him, why is there so little written? Because I was really searching to find this information. And he said, those were scary times and we were busy doing things, not writing them down. And I believe that's probably when he sent me his long sermon. Since the time of my research, though, several books have been written, and a lot of us have been sharing information over the years. There are just some people who are into writing books. It's all I can do to get a sermon or a paper out. So they were welcome to my research. Now, Wednesday, March 24th, McGinty wrote, was a big day. The march was in its fourth day, and early the next morning, UUA delegates were to be placed in the march line to walk the last lap to the State House in Montgomery. But something new had been added. There was to be a giant rally in Montgomery on Wednesday evening. The decision was made to take all Unitarians and Universalists who wanted to go to the rally in Montgomery and then return them to Birmingham for the night and then go back to Montgomery on Thursday morning. So Montgomery's 100 miles from Birmingham, and it complicated matters that they were going to have to pick these people up at the church at midnight and redistribute them to the homes where they were staying. And not only that, but then have them back at the church at 5 a.m. and send them on their way to Montgomery again. By this time, every new crisis or unexpected need was met with the automatic response, "We'll do our best to work it out." Another part of the story that frequently gets repeated is that in the midst of all of this, the congregation was holding its annual budget drive. And that year they decided to go by the book, meaning they were going to follow the UUA's recommended procedures for a successful campaign. And Sunday night there was to be a fellowship dinner at a local restaurant while the children were cared for at the church, which was nearby. That morning, just after the benediction, that Sunday morning, several policemen arrived and called Reverend McGinney outside and said that 3 bombs had been found in the city, in Birmingham. and they were fearful for us, he wrote. There had been no threat, but as a precaution, would I please ask people to leave quickly so they could search the building, which he did, and fortunately no bomb was found, and they made alternate plans to have the children cared for in someone's home that night. The canvas leaders, as was I, he wrote, were afraid that the incident would seriously hurt attendance at the dinner. But that evening, 166 Unitarians gathered and kicked off the canvassing period with a wonderful evening together. He goes on to say how proud he was of the Unitarians in Birmingham, and that on March 24th, a few days later, the every member canvassers had their first report meeting and were enthusiastic about the prospects of a real significant increase in the level of giving. So in March of 1965, Unitarian Universalists from around the country came to Selma to march for civil rights. Our long and sustained commitment to human rights is grounded in liberal theology and reflected in our first principle. Looking back and looking forward, we can clearly see the voice of liberal religion needs to be heard in our communities, needs to be heard in all instances where compassion and justice are being denied. And we know that this struggle is not over yet. We have people here that are in communication with folks in this city who are looking at things like mass incarceration and voter suppression is still happening, and there are all kinds of ways that this injustice continues. And we need to continue to be here to raise awareness and to lift our voices whenever possible and to be a presence for caring and compassion and concern for justice. One of the songs of this time, one of the marching songs is "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Us Around," and I'm going to invite our choir to come up and sing that for us now.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land.
Ain't gonna let no hatred
turn me round, turn me round, turn me round.
Ain't gonna let no hatred
Turn me round, keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no hatred turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Turn me round, keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land.
And I invite you to rise as your body or spirit allow as we sing De Colores, number 305. You do the Spanish really well. You got stronger there than the English. It's because it's really supposed to be sung in Spanish, right? So here are my words of benediction. These are from the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, who some of you may have read some of his books or heard of him. He wrote White Pioneers in a Black Denomination. No, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination, which is the struggle that we're having right now, looking at our white denomination and the struggles of the black ministers who have come before. He says, our history in regard to racial justice is brave enough to make you proud, tragic enough to make you cry, and inept enough to make you laugh once the anger passes. We also have a future. Today's task is to learn from what was and move on. To move on will mean creating a vision for the future. May concern for our faith and love for one another guide our efforts. May it be so.